I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me, everybody? Wonderful. Kyle, thank you so much for the invitation to be with all of you this morning. And special thanks to Eric and Savannah and Adelheid for all of your organizational skills. I've been so impressed with the website and with the program. I do have a couple of other meetings today, but I'm going to be popping in, I hope, popping into sessions whenever I can and hoping to see some of you there. Uh, we've all said what a difficult year this has been. I have never been in one spot this long in my entire adult life. I hear welcome to my home here on the Northern California coast, where I feel lucky to be in a pandemic, but separated from my family. I haven't seen any member of my family in over a year now, and from people that I care about all over this country, and from students that I care about deeply. I have been doing a little I'm retired now. You would think I'd be retired, but I have been doing a little online teaching, so I'm somewhat aware of what everyone has been facing, and have thought that I was so glad to see 2020 go, but 2021 is not shaping up to be all that much better in the short term, but I am hopeful for the long term. And tomorrow at 1:30 on Pacific time, I get my second Moderna injection. So I will be vaccinated for the second time tomorrow, and I'm really thrilled about that. So I'm hoping for vaccinations for all of us in the near future. And I just want to say a word about how much I'm thinking about your students, and we'll be talking about them more today. I want to spend the time I have today to talk about listening, which is something I think we've all had to do a lot of this year, and listening perhaps in ways that we haven't listened before, or in with quite the same intensity that we have had to listen during these pandemic times. So I was browsing the web, as I do a lot here all by myself, trying to keep myself occupied and um, out of trouble. I live in a very remote community here on the coast, and it's possible to go walking, and there is a little therapeutic gym, but that's about it. There's no restaurants, no nothing. So I spent a lot of time on the web, and recently I came across a website with a blog on it, and the name of the website is Oatmail, and the writer is not identified, but it's a young woman, and she had posted this sentence: "Listening is a practice in humility. It closes your mouth while opening your mind." That insightful comment made me think about the words of many other people who have underscored the importance of listening, from as long ago as the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who said we have two ears and one mouth so we can listen twice as much as we speak, or to the wonderful poet Marge Piercy, who says if you want to be listened to, you should put in some time listening, to the literary theorist Nicole Furlong, about whom I'll speak a little bit more later, who says listening is an artistic, civic, and interpretive practice that emerges from a place of wonder, curiosity, and not knowing. Maya Angelou, another wonderful poet, says, listen to yourself, and in that quietude, you might hear the voice of God. I could also quote New York Times columnist Tom Friedman: listening is the ultimate sign of respect. What you say when you listen means more than any words. And finally, and one of my favorites, good old Anonymous: listen and silent are spelled with the same letters. Think about it. So for most of my career, I wanted to focus on writing and speaking rather than on listening. I wanted my students to find their voices and to get their messages out to others. I wanted them to be heard. Perhaps not until I read Krista Ratcliffe's work did I think really hard about the crucial reciprocal relationship between speaking and listening, and understanding, and to come to understand that listening is as important, perhaps more important, than any of the other communicative arts. I came to see the binary between the production of discourse, that is speaking and writing, and the consumption of discourse, listening, that binary was false, to say the very least, and that it depended on an impoverished concept of listening rather than on the kind of listening that the oatmeal writer spoke of, the kind that is a lesson in humility, or that, in Furlong's words, grows out of wonder. As you know, Krista calls this kind of listening rhetorical listening. That is, opening ourselves to the thoughts of others and making an effort not only to hear their words, but to take those words in and fully understand them, to listen to them. This is the kind of listening that some psychologists refer to as deep, but there are other kinds of listening as well, as described by Julie Starr in her coaching manual and by business consultants like Andy Hagerman and Natalie Harvey. There's what these consultants call cosmetic listening. I'm trying to look like I'm listening, but I'm really attending to something else. There's download listening. I'm listening very selectively, just listening to what I already know and think. Conversational listening. I'm ostensibly listening, but more likely I'm thinking about what I am going to say next in this conversation. There's active listening. I think this is the listening that we think about most in the classroom. I'm purposefully giving you my attention and I'm focused on what you are saying. I'm present in the moment and will not be distracted. I will try to say back to you what I am hearing in order to see if I'm really understanding you. And then there's deep, empathetic, rhetorical listening. I am listening actively, without judgment or preconceived ideas. I'm listening to your words and to what lies beyond those words. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes and to experience what you're experiencing. I'm listening to learn, and I will affirm what you have said. So all those kinds of listening and more, I'm going to ask about another one at the very end of these remarks. But listening is very complex, certainly complex enough to spend time on in our classes. And to ask students what I always ask my students to do, and that's to try to take an inventory of their own listening practices, to monitor their listening for at least a day, and to see what kinds of listening they are doing, and to write up what they learn about how they usually listen, what they listen to, how they listen, and why. It probably goes without saying that today, especially, listening is crucially important. But what are some of the things that we already know about listening that make it so important? First, we know that listening is learned. Unlike hearing, which comes naturally unless impeded in some way, we learn to listen through modeling, through instruction, and especially through practice. Put another way, hearing is passive. Sound comes at us, but listening is agentive, based on choices that the listener makes. Second, we know that because of such choices, listening is always subject to our biases and assumptions, which can and do impede our ability to listen because they frame how we listen. Think of a moment about what frames your listening. Maybe the assumptions that somebody is too young or too old to really know very much, or that somebody who doesn't agree with you is just flat out wrong. What are the kinds of listening you practice on a daily basis? What frames your listening? What guides you to listen in certain ways? Actress, playwright, and author Anna Deavere Smith speaks eloquently about listening as the very basis of her craft. Describing the intensive interviewing she did to prepare for her one-woman show, Twilight Los Angeles 1992, I hope all of you have had a chance to see it, in which Smith appears and speaks as a series of people involved in the riots that left Rodney King beaten almost to death. She refers to, quote, the difficult, the heart-filled, the ethical work of listening. That very empathetic and deep listening she had to do in order to inhabit the experiences of the people she portrayed. She had to interrogate her own biases and assumptions and set them aside in order to listen in this way, to listen so that she could experience what her interviewers had experienced. I don't know if you've seen Anna Deavere Smith perform, but she is quite amazing. You might have seen her on The West Wing or some other television show, but these one-woman shows are unbelievable to me. She is such a study of other people. I have a friend who teaches at Penn, who had a chance to spend some time with her when she was on campus to give a performance. And he said that she came into his office and was with him for a couple of hours, and then they had lunch together. And when she got up to leave the lunch, she turned around and became him and started talking to him in his own voice. He said it was one of the most startling moments of his life, that in a couple of hours, she had picked up nuances of his speech, his bodily movements, everything. So Anna Deavere Smith is quite a listener. And her concept of listening underscores something else that we know about listening, that listening can bring people together. I think again of Smith's extraordinary one-woman plays, each of which deals with explosively dangerous situations. The 1992 riots in LA, the 1991 Crown Heights riots in New York, both of them involving serious racial conflict between Koreans and African Americans, between Jews and African Americans. As audiences across the country watched Smith become these characters, turning herself into a tiny Korean shopkeeper one moment and the Reverend Al Sharpton the next, speaking their truths. As audiences listened to these truths, their views on the riots and those involved in them often changed. Such changes were partly in response to Smith's amazingly powerful depiction of the people involved, and to her giving voice to their feelings and thoughts in ways that first got people to listen, and second got them to understand the situations as much more complex than they had thought beforehand. So listening can lead to change, but such changes are also, I believe, partly due to the power of storytelling. As Anna Deavere Smith's work demonstrates, and as novelist Richard Powers notes, the best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. I agree with Powers, which is one reason I encourage student writers to consider using stories and narratives in much of their college writing, from analyses to proposals to reports across the disciplines, and why I have urged that we work toward establishing narrative justice whenever and wherever possible, that we create narratives that can counter what Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of a single story that has labeled and categorized and oppressed so many groups of people throughout history. We need to create and promulgate such just counter narratives, and then we need to work to make sure that others hear them, not just hear them, but listen to them. This is one reason researchers working on listening in Uri Hassan's lab at Princeton advocate public listening, quote, as the way to open up the possibility of new outcomes, new opinions, new understandings of others, even as it also recognizes the nervousness, fear, and hesitation that can also inform our listening practices. In fact, Hassan makes a very strong case for the power of stories, as well as for the importance of listening to stories, based on an intense series of experiments involving brain scans of people telling and listening to stories. Hassan and his researchers studied the brain scans of speakers and listeners over time and in different configurations, and discovered that as the speaker tells a story, the sound waves of the story begin to couple the listener's brain responses to that of the speaker's. In these experiments, sometimes the speaker told the story as written, straightforwardly. Other times the speaker might read it backwards or in random order of sentences or other scrambled ways. While some of the minor coupling occurred even in those scrambled up storytellings, it did so cursorily. So it seemed to be important that the narrative structure hold in order for strong brain coupling to take place. In Hassan's words, the better the listener's understanding of the speaker's story, the stronger the similarity between the two brains. As a commentary remarked after studying this neuroscientific research, a great storyteller literally causes the neurons of an audience to closely sync with that of the storyteller's brain. Hassan's research seems especially important at this moment, when so many people are locked into their own echo chambers, hearing the same stories over and over and over again to the exclusion of any or all others. All those brains coupling and syncing around one narrative, reinforcing it at every turn and making it harder and harder to comprehend any alternative or counter message. People in these echo chambers build common ground, all right, but that very fact then keeps them from establishing common ground with anyone outside the echo chamber, or to communicate and share ideas effectively with people outside it. They turn away from stories representing different points of view and effectively prevent communication, which after all relies on finding some common ground to stand on. Hassan's research convinces me more than ever that if we don't learn to listen openly and carefully to one another, to one another's voices and stories, especially those whose views differ from our own, we can't hope to gain understanding or insight into their motivations, hopes, and goals. That's one reason I'm encouraged to learn that researchers are out right as we speak, trying to interview people who participated in the January 6th assault on our Capitol, for extensive interviews with those people, trying to use deep and active listening to understand their motives. The motives obviously varied across a huge spectrum. What can we know by really listening to those stories? This is also why I often think of Daryl Davis, the African-American musician and activist who has made a practice of seeking out members of the Ku Klux Klan. When I first read about it, I really could hardly believe it. As a young child growing up in the very segregated South, I had recurring nightmares until I was an adult about the Ku Klux Klan coming to get me, and I was a white girl. So the Klan, that's not something I could imagine myself doing, but Daryl Davis, as you probably know, has been doing it for a long time. He wants to do it, he says, because he wants to try to answer a question that's bothered him since he was 10 years old. Why do you hate me when you know nothing about me? Davis says that when he meets with a member of the Klan, he listens very, very hard for the tiniest speck of common ground. Maybe both their kids like soccer. Maybe they both like a particular video game. Maybe they like a kind of music. Maybe they like the same kind of food. And then he tries to build on that one tiny speck of common ground. Davis is convinced that such listening and eventual sharing has been responsible for a number of white men leaving the Klan. There's an interesting documentary on Davis. You may have seen it. It's called Accidental Courtesy, Daryl Davis, Race, and America. And he's also given a very provocative TED Talk called Klan We Talk. I'm mindful, though, that engaging with people whose views differ from ours needs to be premised on safety, personal safety. Davis recalls that for one of his very, very earliest interviews with a Klan member, that Klan member ironically arrived with a bodyguard when it was Davis who might have been in the most grave danger. So I'm not naive or Pollyanna-ish about listening respectfully to those with very different ideas from my own. I saw those people in the Capitol with their poles and spears and other weapons of destruction. So I'm not naive. I know that my own safety counts, as does your safety, as especially do our students' safety. So we need to ask what kinds of situations we could be willing or able to listen in respectfully and openly. And this question brings me to scenes of listening. The scene of Daryl Davis's listening is in person, in RL, as they say, in public, two people face to face or side by side. But there are other scenes, perhaps beginning with the private scene of listening to oneself, a meditative listening that many practice in trying to achieve self-knowledge, the kind of listening that Maya Angelou had in mind when she said, listen to yourself. And in that quietude, you might hear the voice of God, or you might hear a different side of your own voice and come to value that voice. So there's that kind of private listening to yourself, and I think it's very important kind. Then there are virtual scenes of listening, the kind of online listening that we have been doing with our students all this year and that you are doing right now. The scene of listening on this Zoom with our little tiles in front of us. In these situations, what kind of listening do we do? Well, I can tell you that in my Zoom experiences, the kind of listening I'm doing varies widely from the cosmetic to the fully rhetorical. And I wonder what kind of listening I'm asking you to do right now as you join here today. Additionally, though, I think of the print scene of listening, the listening we do when we read print texts. This is the oral listening, the oral literacy that Professor Nicole Furlong discusses in her book, Race Sounds, The Art of Listening in African American Literature. It's a fairly new book and extremely, extremely interesting and provocative. She does case studies of works like The Invisible Man, Their Eyes Are Watching God, and Anna Devere Smith's Twilight Los Angeles. There's a case study of that. Furlong focuses on sound and on the story hearers and the kind of listening they are doing and what that listening brings to the story itself, what the listening brings to the story. She argues for a view of listening as attentive, relational, and deliberate, filled with agency. And she argues for what she calls orally inflected reading practices that can unmute words in print. I really love that concept of unmuting words in print. Furlong's book ends with a chapter on her own class on listening. She sums up with these words: "While I hoped students would grow as listeners, I did not anticipate that their perceptions of themselves as readers and writers would also shift. Helping students learn to listen, to be attentive to others, and to be discerning of all the talk that comes their way can lead to enduring understandings about themselves and the ways in which they engage with and change their world." It seems to me that what Furlong says about her students in this class on listening to print literary texts applies to students in other settings as well. Indeed, that last sentence, with its goal of enduring understandings, is just what is advocated by all the theorists and practitioners that I have been quoting and talking about here today. So, thumbs up for listening. Thumbs up for the complexity and importance of listening to our lives in scenes from private to widely public, in varying modes, in varying scenes, and with varying aims. So what now? How do we engage students in these forms of listening? How can we teach listening? That's what I like to spend a little bit of time talking about. And to get started, here are just a few steps I point my own students to as they begin to study themselves as listeners, as they begin their case studies of themselves as listeners. First, I tell them, please turn off all your devices, clear your mind, be fully present, active, and attentive. Then be aware of your own biases and assumptions. Ditch any agendas you may have and listen with an open mind. Listen to learn with the goal of understanding. Know that you will learn something from everyone. You have the potential to learn something from everyone. And this is a lesson that I learned when I had an amazing opportunity once to team teach a course with Jacqueline Jones Royster. What an experience. On the first day of the class, we went around introducing ourselves and everyone saying what they were doing in the class, what they hoped to get out of it. And at the end, Jackie and I introduced ourselves. And when it was Jackie's turn, she said, "My goal for this class is pretty simple. At the end of the class, I want everyone in here to know that you have something to teach every single person in this class. And I want you to know that you have something to learn from every single person in this class." I memorized that on the spot and take it with me into every class I go into now. So I ask my students, listen to learn. Listen to what you can learn from other people. Then I tell them, let others speak first. And if you ask questions, make sure they are respectful and open-ended. They're not judgmental. And remember to wait. W period, A period, I period, T period, which stands for, why am I talking? Ask yourselves. I should be asking myself that right now. Then listen with empathy, trying to see things from other person's point of view to understand their perspective. Listen to body language, tone of voice, both yours and the other person's. That is, pay attention to the sonic scene, to the sounds around you, what you sound like, what others sound like. Signal that you are listening. Lean in, nod your head, give affirmation. A couple of months ago, had a chance to be at a meeting, a virtual meeting, of course, on the Navajo reservation in Window Rock with a group of young people, young Navajo scholars who were setting about talking with elders in the community about how they had dealt with very difficult times in their lives, including this current pandemic. And they were talking at first about interviews. They were going to do interviews. And at some point, one of the elders, my friend and colleague and former student Rex Lee Jim, said that he thought they were not really talking, that interviews was not really the right word for what they were doing, that they weren't going to be interviewing these elders. They were going to be having conversations with them. And he said, in those conversations, it's really important to let the elders know that you're listening to them. And he talked about Navajo ways of signaling listening. And I watched those young people really listen up when Rex was talking about how they would interact with their elders in this research project. And I tell students to leave time, leave space for reflection, for quiet thinking, silent connections. This is something else I learned from Rex and from my Navajo colleagues. Then I tell students to summarize or repeat back what you think you've heard to see if you've got it right, and to always be on the lookout for common ground. Even as I call out these practices, I hear myself saying, well, that's certainly easier said than done, Andrea. Indeed. That's why I believe we all need to keep listening logs or diaries, and our students need to do so as well. I kept one just recently, and I'll mention it in just a minute. I think we need to record descriptions of our listening, try to capture moments of active or deep listening occurring in or out of our classrooms, and especially, I think, in our classrooms, whether they're virtual or, we hope, again, perhaps next year in person. In this regard, we can all do well to return over and over and over again to Krista Ratcliffe's Rhetorical Listening, Identification, Gender, Whiteness, which is just a keystone book in our field, and particularly to Krista's detailed discussion of what she calls pedagogical listening, pages 146 to 171, if you're taking notes. Indeed, I thought about Krista's book and about what I know and have learned about listening a lot just a few weeks ago when I had a chance to read Professor Lou Mirage's new book, Black or Right, Anti-Racist Campus Rhetorics. It's a book I recommend enthusiastically because, for one thing, it goes a long way toward getting us to a robust, fully realized, fully theorized, and fully practiced African American rhetoric. That is just thrilling to me, just thrilling. I think we've been, with the work of so many people I could call out and you could call out, we've been leading up to this of having a fully realized African American rhetoric. And Lou has just taken us huge steps forward in that endeavor. But also, this is a book that is to be heard, I found as I opened it, to be actively and deeply listened to. It's full of the rich sounds of Lou's native Trinidad, of the places he inhabits in the United States, and especially of his own classrooms. So as I read, I found myself keeping a listening log. I found myself pausing to take in sound effects, to hear Mirage's voice along with the voices of others, and especially the voices of his students, whom he quotes. I kept my listening tips next to me, and referred to them, watching for where my own assumptions and expectations got in the way or prevented my understanding, where my whiteness, my age, my gender were inflecting how and what I was able to hear and listen to. I tried listening as a practice in humility, coming from a place of curiosity and of not knowing. And I came away with new understandings, new ways of knowing, potentially new ways of being, all informed by the wordscape and the soundscape Mirage created, and that I tried to enter and to experience through listening. In this case, what Furlong calls listening to print, which can be augmented in the future as I have opportunities to listen to Mirage in real life or virtual spaces, when the words and sounds will reach me through different media, and when I can try the kind of deliberate, relational, attentive listening that oral engagement affords. And as I listen to the stories Mirage has to tell, I hope my brain waves are syncing with his, that I'm coming closer to true understanding of what his stories mean. And I just will pause momentarily to say, I hope you all will read this book. He talks about 4 practices that he thinks can help, especially African-American students who are operating in a predominantly white university setting, can help them to gain agency and to resist the institutional racism that's all around them. The first one is hashtagging. And the third one, which I really love, is he calls intercontextual reading, which he does a brilliant example of in the book. Well, these are certainly lofty sounding goals, but at heart, I think our goals about listening are pretty simple. When we really listen to one another, we have a chance of understanding one another. We have a chance of establishing and making common ground. Finding common ground. I'm sorry, we have a chance of finding common ground in order to make common cause, and all for the common good. That's why we should practice listening. That's why we should pay attention to listening. That's why we should teach listening. I want to thank you for your very generous listening today. And I want to end with a question that I hope we might focus on in sessions later today. I don't know if we have any time for discussion right now, but this is my question. What does it mean to listen interdisciplinarily? What does it mean to listen interdisciplinarily? With that question, I thank you again for your kind attention, for giving me a chance to share this moment with you. I'm wishing you all the best and your students all the best for a safe and healthy year coming up. Thank you again. Thank you.
Eric, do we have to moderate some questions? Do you want to facilitate that process?
Yeah, we do have some time. Sessions don't start till 10:15, so we have a good 10, 15 minutes, maybe even 20, because no one has to physically go anywhere. They just kind of have to go to another Zoom room. But I see a lot of hands popping up. If you have a question, you might just want to unmute your microphone and ask Dr. Lunsford. And if you want to put a question in the chat, I can facilitate that and make it a little bit easier too. But I see Corey Wells, I see you have a hand up and you just popped right up there. So if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really inspiring. And I wrote down all these names that you brought up, and a lot of them were novelists and performers. And we don't typically teach, the kind of fictional writing that they do, but engage in. But I really do focus on narrative and as one of the main strategies, and extended analogy. But also from the 4th edition of your book, writing, everything's an argument. You had a whole chapter on humor, and I loved it. I really loved it. And now there's like 2 pages. And I think it's such a critical tool and such a useful tool for so many reasons that I shamelessly still, along with your current book, give them that chapter. And we have a humor and proposal paper. And I think and we do stylistic analysis of other people's humor articles and their effectiveness or lack thereof. And I just wonder why you took it out.
It broke our hearts. John and I pleaded and begged, but people didn't teach it. That's why we took it out. I miss it a lot, and I agree with you that humor is really important. And boy, if we've ever needed a touch of humor, it is right now. And I love that, having students. I often ask them to take on assignments that might lead to some humor, and also to stylistic analysis. One of the assignments that I always give at a point in the term when we're just exhausted with our research and don't want to ever talk about it again, maybe. I ask that we choose a children's story that we all know, and then write the opening of it in the voice of an author that they admire.
Mhm.
It's an imitatio exercise, essentially. And I have had so much fun over the years. One year when I was doing this, a chemistry major in the class wrote the opening as Edgar Allan Poe might have written it. It was just pitch perfect. And then of course we get to read them out aloud in class, again, for the oral component. And I think that I got really most interested in orality when in 2000, when I moved to Stanford, and two students, entering Frosh and a law student, came to ask me if I would help them to found the Stanford Spoken Word Collective, which I did. And with the Spoken Word Collective met every Thursday night at the Writing Center, and still meets every Thursday night in the Writing Center. But it's gotten so huge now, their performances are so amazingly popular and wonderful that they can't perform in the Writing Center anymore because it's not big enough for their venue. But they did everything, of course, aloud, and I really listened to them and learned to listen in a new way. I think maybe that helped me some in reading Lou's book, my experience with Spoken Word Collective. So keep up with the humor. Keep up with the humor.
Can't help it, must.
John and I have just finished I'm just reading page proofs right now of the next edition of Everything's an Argument. What an interesting book that's been to work on over really decades now, to think about argument. And my understandings of argument have grown over the time that I've worked on that book, and expanded. I think I'm a much better arguer and a much better teacher of argument now than I was when I first started. That would
Well,
be.
I vote for putting back in the humor chapter.
I'm going to tell them we've got it. We could do it in a heartbeat.
Dr. Reiner, I see that you have your hand raised for a question.
First, thank you for that amazing talk. I really appreciated it. I was wondering how you implicitly or explicitly set the threshold of what's worth listening to in your classes for your students. I'm thinking that it's important to listen to Klan members and the insurrectionists, right, to understand where they're coming from. But I'm also thinking about all of the attention that, say, national newspapers spent after Trump was elected, listening to white voters, and how little attention has been given to the quotidian experience of Black voters across the country, right? Even after Georgia's flipped, right? You haven't had that same threshold met for different groups, and particularly for the quotidian experience of a lot of Americans.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and I'm very glad that you raised it. In my classes, we talk explicitly about our classroom ethos. And my definition of rhetoric is the art, practice, and theory of ethical communication. So everything we do in our classes has an ethical component. And we talk quite a lot about how to speak ethically, how to speak in a way that is aimed at understanding and truth rather than at, let's say, ad hominem kinds of attacks. And I usually ask students to agree to a pact that we're going to have in our communications with each other in our classrooms. So that's the way I begin to set the bar in class about what's worth listening to. You have to have something to say that is worth listening to in order to have the right to speak. So I've had over the years when I've done that in my classes, I've had to, the students get behind it, and they want to be much more rigid than I want to be in what counts as being something worthy of listening to. So I try to back them off that a little bit, but at the base, I think we can't listen to everything. We're just incapable of it. So we do have to choose. But what I want to emphasize is why we're choosing what we choose. What are the bases on which we choose to listen or not listen? And those people who didn't listen to Black people across, I mean, Black people have been trying to tell us for 100 years, longer than that, about police brutality. So why haven't we listened to them? All of those people need to think, who were not listening, need to think, why weren't they listening? What was guiding their listening? That's why I'm such a big proponent of trying to interrogate your own listening and to make an inventory of your listening and try to see why you listen, what you listen to. In the last year, I have forced myself to listen to Fox News, and I had to force myself. And it was at times excruciating, and I couldn't manage it for very long, especially some of the more virulent, the talk show people like Sean Hannity or what's his name, Tucker Carlson. But I really forced myself to listen to some of it, even though I decided that much of it was not worth listening to. So those are choices that we have to make. I think we ought to make them conscious in our classrooms, conscious about why we are choosing to listen to one thing and not another. Bradley, do you have an answer to your own question?
No, I absolutely don't. It was really a legitimate question, and I think
Yeah.
a strategy one, a pedagogical strategy one, as much as anything.
Yeah. Well, I think we set the parameters, and of course we set examples. It's by our own listening, and I have learned over the years that I am often in the classroom not a particularly good listener, and had to back up. One of the exercises that I used to do in class is ask a student to be the recorder of the day, not to speak, but to listen to what was happening in the class and to give a report the next day about the dynamics, just what happened in our class. And I learned once in that the person who was observing came back and reported that whenever I made a comment, 95% of the time after I said anything, a white male said something. 95% of the time. What was that about? What was going on? So I've learned that I need help in listening in my classes, and I enlist students in trying to help me listen in the most productive kinds of ways. You know, that student that sits in the back of the class with a ball cap twisted backwards, slumped in the chair. What's happening? How can I listen to that student? How can I listen?
Sorry, I actually had a question, Dr. Lunsford. Do you have any tips for listening in kind of the silent Zoom digital spaces that our classrooms are often enveloped in now? Because you mentioned the student in the back of your classroom, but in my Zoom rooms, they tend to be very, very quiet, which is very different from how my classes normally are. And it kind of shakes me a little bit as a teacher. And I'm just wondering if you've kind of thought about any of the ways to open up listening in our kind of current pandemic teaching issues.
I'm going to tack on to that before you answer, because I had something similar. I wrote down all of the strategies that you listed. It was like 1 through 8. And I really liked how your classes are built upon this concept of listening. For those of us who want to shift our classes to that mid-semester and kind of break some of the bad habits that we have as teachers and maybe our students have as well. I think that's, maybe I'm asking the same question, but thickening it a little bit.
Yeah, excuse me. I want to acknowledge how hard I think it is to listen in this kind of a situation. I think our students are up against it, really up against it. And so first of all, I want to acknowledge that. I want to get them to talk about that. Why is that so? Why are these little boxes so hard to listen to? And then in my experience, many students who would speak up in class feel alienated in this, I don't know exactly how to, they feel super shy. My grandniece, who's in the 7th grade, will not speak. She hasn't said a word in her online classes. And she's the most gregarious blabbermouth of a kid. So there are psychological issues at work here that I think we don't have much control over. But what we can do is to acknowledge that we're all having very different experiences and give a chance for students to talk about that just a little bit. I think that's one thing. Then I also have had some luck in asking students to write for a moment. I mean, for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and then to just read what they've written so that I get to hear their voices. And I don't know how you feel about singling out students or calling on students, but if I know, if I know my class well enough, I will call on particular students that I feel are not too self-conscious, that would be willing to speak, maybe even at length in class. And I think that encourages other students. And then of course, there are I'm sure you do have use breakout rooms.
Yeah, we do.
And I think that I found that students will often talk in those breakout rooms when they don't want to talk in the larger setting. And that gives me a little hope. But this is, I'd love to hear from some of the rest of you about how you're dealing with this, with this issue. It's just so good to see everybody. I want to get as close as I can to the screen, trying to see your faces.
I don't know if this is allowed or not, but since we can't require students to even turn on their cameras, we can encourage them. I'd give extra credit for it, and most of them buy it. So at least to have their faces available, I think really enhances the classroom. I don't make anybody, and I certainly don't punish anybody if they don't.
No. How do you have a chance to confer one-on-one with your students? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I still conference with all of my students for each project, and that I did it much earlier this semester than I probably would have in other semesters, and that certainly does go a long way. They're very talkative in the conference, but then when you get them into the large classroom for class, it's like night and day. And I'm trying to figure out what the disconnect is and how to address the problem.
No, I think it's the artificiality of it, just short and simple. But you might have an opportunity, Eric, to give a shout out in the big class for something that came up in a discussion. Say, oh, as Cornelia just mentioned the other day, this made a fabulous point. And I wondered about actually making room for shout outs. You know, when I was talking about what the lesson Jackie Royster taught me about learning, that you could teach every person, but you could also learn from every person. Whether I could encourage students to give shout outs to each other. What I learned from this person or that person. This is another lesson I learned teaching a class on the history of writing at the Breadlow School of English. And it was a bunch of, there were two women of color in the class. Two African-American women in the class, a bunch of white people, and a Yupik native from Alaska, a tiny village. She was the keeper of stories in her village. And when we went around introducing ourselves, and she just looked around the class and said, I just want to know what it is with you people about writing. That's why I'm taking this course. I don't really think writing is very important. She was the storyteller. She was the keeper of stories. At the end of the class, it was a class with 12 students. It was a graduate class, of course, at Breadlow. We went around to sum up the course, what we'd done, what our projects were, and so forth. And all of us folks, except Yvonne, got up and talked about the projects we'd done. I did this, I did that, I did the other thing, I did this, blah, 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 me. Yvonne got up and said, and she had a yellow pad in front of her. And she turned to each person in the class in turn and said, Judy, what I learned from you this term was, Kyle, what I learned from you, Seth, what I learned from you, I was dumbfounded and so impressed with her ability to listen, but then with her ability to give back something to us that she'd gotten from us. It was quite a moment. So I do think that if we can encourage students to try that and maybe do those shout outs for each other, they might like it.
I think I probably speak for everyone, Andrea, when I say that we could do this all day. We are so incredibly grateful that you took time with us this morning. I want to be mindful of the time so that everybody has a chance to present their incredible work moving forward. Please, I did an event like this and I said, I wish we were all together so you could hear the appreciation auditorily from all of the major clapping that we would do if you were normally with us. I've been in a room where you've received that kind of praise. So y'all, I don't know if you can communicate gesturally how you feel about Andrea's visit this morning. I'd probably be jumping up and down if I didn't hit my head, but thank you. Thank all of you for coming to this event. I hope that you find it rewarding. If you find these kinds of experiences valuable, would you just send me a note at the end of the day and just say, these are the things that I found particularly helpful in this composition conference. I can't be everywhere at once, but what I want to be able to do is communicate the value of what each of you bring to our program as we move forward together the rest of the spring semester and into the fall. And then I can advocate on your behalf and say, look at all the amazing things that we're doing together if we just have the opportunity. So Andrea, again, thank you. You're amazing, you know that.
Kyle, can I say one more word? I would, if anybody is interested in this little talk, I'd be glad to send it to be posted if there's a way to do that, or if you wanted to contact me, I'd be happy. So tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Send it to me and I'll make sure everybody gets it.
I'll send it to you then. Thank you. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day. I hope to see you in some of the other sessions.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lunsford.